right, it's about time to begin. Man, the way my voice changes when I speak into this thing. Let's get started with the word of prayer and then we'll dive in. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study your word. Just thank you for those that are present here today and the encouragement that's brought when we come together. Continue to be with all those who might be struggling in whatever way. Be with those that are traveling. We ask that you be with our brother Don as he's preparing to travel to Yellowstone and just keep him safe on his travels. Continue to be with Desiree and just our little baby that's on the way. Pray that all might go well with that. Father, help us to clear our minds of any cares and concerns we might have so that we can look into your word with clear minds and just with our hearts that are ready to receive your word. That's in your son's name we pray. Amen. I lost my word in that prayer. I was trying to say receptive, but that didn't sound right. So let's open up to Genesis 4. That's where we're going to be spending our time today. I would just like to start off right off the bat, verses 1 and 2 of this chapter. It says, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground." Now, these two verses introduce for us one of the more familiar stories of the Bible, and that's the story of Cain and Abel. But in those two verses, what do we learn about these brothers? Just in the opening verses of the chapter. Okay, Cain was the firstborn. Okay. What else? What were their occupations? A shepherd and a farmer. The text says a keeper of flocks. Cain, tiller of the ground, but yes, would be a shepherd and a farmer. Any other observations before we keep plowing forward? All right. So I think those things that have been said really help us get started with what we're going to be looking at today. Again, this is one of the most familiar stories of the Bible, but what is the most familiar aspect? When you hear about the story of Cain and Abel, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Cain killed Abel. That's what we think of, and that's fine, because that's true. That did happen. Why did he kill Abel? I mean, when you ask that question, what are some ideas that come to your mind? Okay, he was jealous. Okay. He was jealous. Why was he jealous? Yeah, exactly. That's one of the things we learned. Abel offered the more acceptable sacrifice to God that created some feelings of jealousy and not to mention anger that comes out in chapter 4. So those are all true things, and it's stuff we're going to talk about today. But when we read chapter 4, there is more to the story. It's not just Cain killed Abel. It's not just Cain got jealous. It's not just those things that have been said. But what we find in chapter 4, it's a story more about Cain than anything else. How this man named Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, as a result of his actions toward his brother, was exiled from the presence of God. And what we find in this chapter is a legacy of sorts that was left behind by Cain. And what I think this legacy is, I'm going to use that word, legacy. It really serves as a warning to God's people to avoid following in the example of Cain. So with that being true, what we're going to do today is really take a survey of Genesis 4 and examine for ourselves a few points about what the story of Cain and Abel is really about. And we'll find that this story is really about Cain more than it is about Abel. And I want to point out just different aspects about Cain that we'll see in this chapter. The first one we'll see in verses 3 through 7 is Cain's attitude toward God. Secondly, in verses 8 through 15, we'll see Cain's attitude toward his brother. And finally, the chapter closes in verses 16 through 24 about his lineage. Now, after these things, the author of Genesis concludes the chapter by setting the stage in verses 25 and 26 for what the story of Cain and Abel resulted in for Adam and Eve, and by extension for all mankind. So, yes, we're going to look through the whole chapter in the time that we have, but I think we'll glean some good information from these things. Anything else on verses 1 and 2? Okay. So we'll begin looking at the first point in verses 3 through 8. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses for us.
In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. And the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. How far?
Through verse 8, please.
Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him.
All right. Had you go a little too far. I was meaning to go through verse 7, but that's okay. So again, through verse 7, we're going to see Cain's attitude toward God. Now, what's the first thing that happens? What do Cain and Abel do? Brought an offering to the Lord. So so it's a sacrifice they're making. Now, what's the nature of these sacrifices? In other words, what do they have to do with? Their occupations. You're reading my notes, Mom. But that's exactly right. It's the occupations. So, Cain offers what the text calls the fruit of the ground, at least in the American Standard. It had something to do with him being a ground tiller. The text doesn't tell us exactly what. Then Abel offers the first of his flocks as well as a fat portion. Now, what's the difference between the two sacrifices as far as God is concerned? Okay, so that's something we might glean from the text. But the text also says that God accepted the sacrifice of Abel and rejected Cain's. Now, we don't know for certain why this was, but there's one passage in the New Testament that indicates one possible reason. We're not going to go there, but Hebrews 11 verse 4 says, "By faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain." Now, applying that here, what Hebrews 11:4 tells us is that the main reason God accepted Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's is because Abel's was offered in faith, and it's possible that Cain's was not. Now, the text doesn't tell us that for certain, but Hebrews 11 verse 4 is an important passage here. Anything else on verses 3 or 4 before we go to verse 5?
You don't get that Cain, the reading of the New International is that Cain brought some. It seems to maybe indicate the quality of what he brought. Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil, and Abel brought of the firstborn.
Right.
Seems to me that Abel brought the best, you know, and Cable brought some, or yeah, I'm gonna combine both names, Cable,
It's easy to do.
and Cain brought some of what he had,
Right.
and Abel brought the best of what he had.
That's definitely true as far as Abel bringing the best, because the firstlings, when we read later in the New Old Testament, that's what God wanted, was the first of the crops, animals, whatever it was. So that's definitely a point we can glean that Abel did that, but Cain probably did not. Andrea? Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to build on what Jim said. I agree. And so it maybe gives us a look into Cain's heart.
Exactly.
You know, maybe his heart, he was being a little selfish
That's
and
possible.
not giving his best like Abel did. Um, he might have been holding back and just kind of going through the motion of just whatever, I'm going to give it, whatever. It doesn't have, you know. So I just think it gives a little peek into his heart.
Absolutely. And we're going to see this and how he responds to how God is dealing with all this. Anything else on verses 3 and 4?
So are they, I always thought when they gave offerings that it was, that it was an animal sacrifice or a blood or some, it had something to do. I didn't, I don't see any other examples, maybe I just don't know of any that are fruit, you know, of the ground.
I see where you're going with
You know
that.
what I think? Wasn't there, I mean, I don't understand because I haven't seen, I haven't heard of any. So I always thought that they were supposed to do offerings that were,
Let me answer that. Let me answer that in two ways, because there's a two-part answer to that. Number one, the first thing we need to remember here when we're looking at Genesis, the law of Moses is not yet instituted. That doesn't happen until Moses comes on the scene. Secondly, when we do look after the Moses, in some case, I can't point to a specific passage, but in some cases, people's sacrifice did have to do with what they did with their lives. Um, Again, I can't point to a specific passage, but in other cases, there was the animal sacrifices, like at the Passover, for instance, they sacrificed the lamb for the atonement of sin. Um, that's not what's going on here. All Cain and Abel are doing is sacrificing to God whatever it was that they had to do with their occupation. Does that help you a little bit?
And people did bring grain offerings
Yeah.
and offerings just to show their appreciation and their thankfulness,
Right.
you know. Now, when it had
The
to
free
do with
will
sin,
offerings.
yeah, and when
Yeah.
it had to do with sin, that was different
Yeah.
in Moses' time, you know. Like you said, we're before that,
Yeah.
but people did bring other types of offerings.
Yeah, because when you read Leviticus, for instance, it's very detailed, the different kind of sacrifices that occurred. And one of those was free will offerings. So
so these are like free will offerings?
that's what I would call them. Whether or not God demanded these sacrifices of them, the text doesn't tell us because, again, the law of Moses isn't in place yet. Um, when you get over to Abraham, God does ask for sacrifices, but the regulations behind it are not yet in place, at least as far as we can tell from the text of Genesis.
What would cause them to do this? I mean, this is obviously the beginning of them doing these. I'm just asking why would, I just,
I don't know. Um, they had, I mean, just from Adam and Eve were their parents. So they had some knowledge of God. And so I don't know. Just,
That wasn't revealed to us at this
it's,
point,
yeah.
you know, so we can.
So all I can say is maybe Adam and Eve had some influence over them in this respect.
Well, there was a lot that wasn't revealed, honestly,
Yeah.
to us. I mean, a huge amount.
a huge, huge amount. I mean, even back at in verses 3 and 4, it's that what's occurring here occurred sometime
Well,
later.
It's some type of worship.
Yeah,
and we can speculate quite a bit,
we could.
Right.
and maybe we might be right, but we don't truly know.
Yeah, because the text just doesn't tell us.
Obviously, one of the things that we can learn from this, if we already know it, of course, is that you don't you try to correct what you've done wrong. You don't try to blame someone else, and that's exactly what he did.
Right.
He blamed his brother for for doing something good instead of the introspection that that he needed to take, and why wasn't it pleasing to God?
Yeah.
Why wasn't it okay?
And that's where Hebrews 11:4 comes in. That gives us some insight. So,
Well,
yeah,
we needed that, I think,
yeah,
because we'd been out in the wind totally without that.
yeah. So anyway, I wish I could tell you more, but I don't have any more information as to the nature of these sacrifices because all we know is the law of Moses wasn't in place yet.
I do think it's some type, it's a type of worship.
Right.
Obviously would have wanted to have worshipped God.
Yeah. And that's what's going on here is it's some kind of worship. And Hebrews 11:4 is all the information we have as to why God accepted Abel's but not Cain's. Any other questions before we get to verse 6?
We can interpolate.
Verses 5 and 6?
We can interpolate from later what was acceptable and not acceptable in the law of Moses, and
Yeah.
interpolate that back. And as a general rule, well, this probably wasn't acceptable, or this would have been.
Right.
So I think the speculation put out that it wasn't by Andrew. I think that it wasn't best of his fruits of the garden is almost certainly true, because we know that that's not acceptable.
Exactly.
Sacrifice. So, and I don't think it would have been then either.
Right.
I mean, versus in Moses' time, that probably didn't change.
Yeah, you might be right. So, but the point we're looking at here is that God rejected Cain's sacrifice, accepted Abel's. Now, how does Cain respond? What's the first thing that happens in verse 5?
Angry.
He's angry and
Downcast.
his face was downcast. So, he's angry and his face was downcast. What's the picture being drawn there?
Sulky child.
A sulky child. Exactly. He's pouting. That's what he's doing here. When the face is downcast, it's that pouting. Now, Desiree will tell you I am the worst pouter when I get mad. My face gets downcast. But that's exactly what's going on. And the New American Standard translates that phrase, face downcast, as your countenance, but your face being downcast is the better translation. So he's visibly angry, is the idea here. So as a result of these things, what does God say to him? What? Okay, exactly. You ask him these questions. Why are you sad, downcast? Why are you angry? What else does he tell him in verse 7? That's it. That's what the text says. So what is God encouraging Cain to do? To get his heart right. To take responsibility for his own actions. So he's giving him an opportunity to change his behavior. This is exactly what God did with Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. Where are you? Did you eat of the fruit? It's questions with the intention of getting a change of behavior. But God warns him. If you don't, Cain, sin is crouching at the door in its desires for you, but you must master it or rule over it.
It seems odd that he would be so angry with his brother if usually you get angry at the other person. It would be God, in my opinion. If God accepted Abel and he didn't accept Cain's, why wasn't he angry with God?
I think he was angry with God.
Yeah, but it says that he, and
Yeah, you can't kill God.
Can't kill God.
you know. But his anger was misplaced, in a lot of ways. He was angry with God, but he was
But
also angry with himself because he didn't do what was right. But kind of that we project onto other people, I guess. So
that seems to be what's going on here. Now, how is sin pictured in this verse according to what um, God says to Cain? That's exactly what it is. It's crouching at the door. You might have a wild animal on the other side of your door. Open that door, that animal's going to pounce on you. And we know that because that's what this phrase pictures. So God is telling Cain, Cain, sin is ready to pounce on you. But what can Cain do in this situation?
Take
Take,
master it, control it, yeah.
yeah, to take control over it. So everything that's about to happen, if Cain didn't change his behavior, it could be prevented if Cain had made different choices. But what we're seeing here is Cain's attitude toward God.
I mean, God's speaking to him.
Right.
You'd think that would wake you up.
You would think. But this isn't the last time something like this happens.
Right, we're seeing another example of a hardened heart.
Right.
And I know it's clearly seen here, God wants to be the best in your life. He wants you to give him everything that is important to you. I mean, you can see that clearly here, that you need to be giving him the best of everything. That means putting, I don't know.
That's good application of this. So, we're seeing Cain's attitude toward God. He didn't give him what God wanted, it appears. And he gets angry over it. He has the opportunity to change his behavior, but he's still angry. And we see this in how he responds to his brother in verses 8 through 15. We already read verse 8, but going on into verse 9, it says, "And the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is Abel your brother?' And he said, 'I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?' He said, 'What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth.' Cain said to the Lord, 'My punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and your face from your face I will be hidden. And I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me.' So the Lord said to him, 'Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold.' And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him." So here's where we begin to see, again beginning in verse 8, Cain tells his brother something. But what's the point verse 8 is making? It's already been said today. What does Cain do?
Murders his brother.
Murders his brother. So that's the point that's being made here in verse 8. Now there is some difficulty in this verse, because the verse starts off, Cain told Abel his brother, or said something to him. Now from the context it might be what God said to him, but we can't know for certain. All we know is whatever it was, it resulted in Cain murdering Abel's. Now, one reason we can assume that Cain and Abel being brothers is emphasized here is because from this point, clear through verse 11, 4 times the word brother is used. So what's being emphasized here is that Cain killed his brother. This wasn't just Cain killed some stranger. He killed his brother. And that's what makes this especially horrible. His family member. But something else that I shared with Desiree the other day as I was looking at this, not only killed his brother, he killed his mother's son. And that's something to keep in mind here that really comes out at the end of the chapter. But what does God do? What does he ask? Where's Abel? Your brother. There's that word again. What does Cain say? I don't know.
He lies.
You know, this part in verse 9 belongs in both parts, because I think this shows an attitude towards Abel, Cain's attitude towards Abel. But if I had talked to my dad this way, the way that he talks to the Lord, I would have been in severe trouble.
That's true.
This is severe back talk.
Absolutely.
How he's talking to God here.
Absolutely, yes it
You
is.
know, not necessarily the I don't know is out there not so bad, but am I my brother's keeper? That's really back talk.
Yes it is. What does that question mean? Am I my brother's keeper? It's a very important question.
Am I responsible for my brother?
Am I responsible for my brother? Dean said, am I supposed to take care of him?
Yes.
Yes, that's the implied answer. But that's not Cain's mindset. It is severe back talk in a way. Cain's saying, I don't know. He's not my responsibility.
And my notes mention that it's sarcastic because it's a play on words, like his brother was the shepherd, and he's saying, I'm not the shepherd.
That might be
A
part of
little
the
bit,
picture
like
here.
you said, disrespectful, sarcastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And something we have to remember is that God already knows the answers to these questions. Same thing as in Genesis 3, the questions God asked Adam there. Where are you? He knows. But he's giving Cain an opportunity again to acknowledge what he's done. But Cain says, I don't know. I'm not my brother's keeper.
Giving him an opportunity to repent.
Absolutely.
And he still denies.
Yeah.
He still denies.
He lies.
It wasn't just an act of, when he killed him, it wasn't just an act, I don't know how they say it, where it was a spur of the moment thing, from him being upset, just something that happened.
Some emotional
Yeah.
overtook him.
Because he's still angry. He's still showing that. He has no remorse at all for anything that he did. And I feel bad for Adam and Eve. They raised both these boys, and it goes to show us, a lot of people say you can raise children exactly the same, but obviously they can be different, can't they?
They can't.
And God gave us free will, and it really does show that. I mean, where everybody thinks that, they should go back and look at this, because poor Adam and Eve must be feeling really bad, that not just that their son did that their son is gone, but that Abel has this whole attitude. Where did it all come from? How did he get this when Abel was
Righteous.
so different, and he loved the Lord, and Cain doesn't seem to be thinking about the Lord at all with his response and his attitude towards him.
Yeah. So that's what's going on in verse 9. Now, what else does God say in verse 10? Okay. Yeah, he says, what have you done? But what else does he say? What does that mean? Your brother's blood is crying out from the ground?
He knows what happened.
He knows what happened. So that's true. God knows what happens. This is where we see it. But also the picture there is that Abel is crying out for justice. He wants justice to be done. Now, it's used in this language, your brother's blood is crying out, but it's the idea of justice. Something has to be done. So that's what God does. He does something about it. In verses 11 and 12, there's another curse that's given. Now, what's the curse that God gives in verses 11 and 12?
He'd been
That's it. It's another land curse. We already saw it in Genesis. By the sweat of your brow, you'll provide bread. He already did it to Adam and Eve. But now, it's another land curse that we're reading about. The land would produce nothing for Cain. Now, Adam, he'd have to work at it. He'd still get something. Cain, God says to Cain, you're going to get nothing from your tilling the land. So as a result of that, what does verse 12 say Cain would become? A vagabond. A vagrant and a wanderer is what the New American Standard uses. So what does that picture? What's Cain's life going to be like? Miserable. Okay. So he's being exiled. They've already been exiled from Eden, but now it's more of an exile from wherever Cain was when this took place. So how does Cain respond in verses 13 and 14? He complains about it. He says the punishment's too great to bear, God. He doesn't think he'd be able to deal with this. So Cain draws attention to the fact that as a result of this, he believes he will be removed from God's presence. And what else does he think will happen to him? That he's going to die. Somebody is going to kill him. So again, as was said earlier, Cain's not remorseful. He doesn't care as what has happened to his brother. He's more concerned with himself. He's more concerned with what's about to happen to him. So he's not sorry at what he'd done, but he's more sorry he got caught, we might say. So, what does God do there in verse 15? Exactly. So he's put some kind of a sign that would prevent Cain from being killed. And if he was, God would avenge him. Now, this is all due to Cain's fear. Now, we see this phrase sevenfold. Now, one thing we know from the Old Testament is that the number 7 was associated with God. Creation 6 days, rested on the 7th. So this is a way of saying that complete vengeance would be taken if somebody killed him. But he appoints this sign. Now, we don't know what the nature of this sign was. We can't know. All we know from the text is that this was a sign that would protect Cain from being murdered. But what we're seeing in verses 8 through 15 is Cain's attitude toward his brother. It all hinges upon that. He didn't care about his brother. He didn't see himself as being responsible for his brother. So he gets angry with him and kills him. Matt, is your hand up? That's the other, it might be, I don't know. I'd like to pretend. That might be it, because we begin to see his lineage in verses 16 through 24. Andrew, go ahead.
Kind of a point I was going to make. We're not told their ages. I mean, we know
Right.
they let, Adam lived to be over 900 years old. So, we don't exactly know when this could be, but by indication, where he's saying, someone could find me and kill me, indicates there's other people, and that he's worried about them killing him. There's abundant sin already.
Right.
Those people, he's aware of other people killing. He wasn't. This is the first time we know of murder, but it may have happened elsewhere. We don't know.
That's possible. And yeah, we can't know. But that's a good question.
Well, over a period of several hundred years, maybe from Adam and Eve, there could be hundreds and hundreds of cousins and distant cousins upon the earth.
That's possible.
Well, no,
So,
that would be the way it would work. I mean,
yeah.
that's what do you call it? Not linear, but it's algebraic.
Exponential.
Yeah.
Exponential. Actually, it is.
Yeah, and this is just a glimpse of what we're getting at. It's just one story of other things. We just don't know how much time has passed and what's everything that's gone on.
Could be 800 years.
Could be.
Look how much has changed in the United States in a little over 200.
That's true. So, Cain's been cursed. He's being cast out from God's presence. And now what we're going to see in verse 16 through 24, we're not going to spend a lot of time with it. But he goes out from the presence of the Lord. Verse 16, this is beginning to show us Cain's lineage, that third point. And he settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So he's somewhere east of the Garden of Eden, even further removed from Eden. Now this word Nod, it comes from a word that means wanderer. So we don't know if this is an actual place or if it's just a place that received its name. Well, it is an actual place. Okay, let me rephrase, I'm sorry. The word Nod means wanderer. But this is the only time we read about it in the Bible. But it received its name from the fact that this is where Cain settled because of the fact that he became this vagrant and wanderer. So he has relations with his wife. He begins his own, a list of descendants begins beginning with Enoch. And what we're also told is that Cain built a city with his name. Continuing in verse 18, the author of Genesis records for us a brief list of the descendants of Irad. We don't have a whole lot of information on them. But then that list concludes with not Methuselah, but Methushael becoming the father of Lamech. Don, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see you.
For 12 families, basically 12 brothers.
12 tribes, yeah. Oh, the 12 brothers back, yeah.
In whatever families they had, and they were there for 200 years, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
400 years.
Yeah.
In that time, there were. I think there were 80 that went down there. 80 that went down, and there were over 1 million, weren't there, or more? I think more than 1 million that came out.
Yeah.
And that's the math is in there actually.
It is. So yeah. So all good points. But again, what we're looking at beginning of verse 16 clear through verse 24 is a lineage, but the one that's emphasized here is Lamech. He had 2 wives. The author gives us a brief description. One of those was, they were Ada and Zillah. Ada had children, the first one being Jabal, the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. Jabal's brother Jubal, just a difference in vowel there, was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. Lamech's second wife, Zillah, in verse 22, she gave birth to this individual, Tubal-Cain. We see Cain's name in there. He was the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, had a sister named Naamah. Yes, I know I'm going through this pretty quick. But after listing that record, in verses 23 and 24, the author of Genesis records for us a statement from Lamech to his wives that surrounds the fact that he killed someone for wounding and striking him, resulting in belief that he, like Cain, would be avenged. I'll just read that. It says, Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice. You wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. Now, this has been seen as a sort of poem where Lamech is boasting in his victory over his enemies. Like Cain, he was a violent man. But this poem's been called the Song of the Sword because this poem is a poem about his victory over a man and this boy who are probably the same person, seem to have attempted to kill him. So this is why we're seeing in chapter 4 is Cain's legacy. His legacy is one of violence. And this is seen in people like Lamech. I know I went through that pretty quick. Before we get to verse 25 and 26, anything, other questions up to this point?
Has Seth been born yet?
No, because Seth comes after.
Then it throws a monkey wrench into
there you go. That answers that question. So,
But we don't know when it says, I'll let you go on.
There's only two brothers.
Right.
yeah. But Cain, we have to ask where his wife came from and all that, but that's a discussion. Because what we're trying to do here is just look at what the text says. There are 4 words that we always need to keep in mind. Stay with the text, because we're missing a lot of information that we'd like to have. And that's unfortunate, because I would love to have some of this information. But Seth is not born till sometime after, because the chapter concludes, Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth, to him also was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Verses 25 and 26 introduce what's going to be described in chapter 5, concluding with Noah. But I think the picture is being painted here, Seth was given because Cain killed Abel. So the righteousness of Abel is beginning to be emphasized here. And there's going to be another character named Lamech in chapter 5 who becomes the father of Noah. So we have to assume that there might be some sisters intermingled in all this, because I have to ask, where did their wife come from? Again, we went through that lineage pretty quick. Any questions or comments on verses 25 and 26? Okay. So putting everything that we've read in chapter 4, this is a story about Cain, and about how through the events of this story, God would continue to carry out his plan that would ultimately result in the salvation of mankind. Seth is born. Seth would become one of the ancestors of another Lamech. That Lamech would become the father of Noah. And of course, the most important way that God would carry out his salvation for mankind is through Jesus several centuries after this point. But the story of Cain and Abel serves as a reminder that God carries out his plan through individual people. The story shows us that people God uses might not be people who are pleasing in his sight, but Cain was still part of the plan. He was still an instrument of God's will. And so we have to let God use us. Make a decision to submit to his will and have the proper attitude toward God and toward each other. And we are our brother's keeper. That's another application from this. We are responsible for each other. We're our brothers and sisters' keeper, which Cain failed to realize. So that's chapter 4 for you in a nutshell. A very small nutshell. Any other questions or comments?
I just think it again shows he's after our hearts and our personal relationship
Absolutely.
with him. That's what's important to him, is our intention, our heart, and he knows it. He knows what's really in our hearts, so there's no sense trying to hide that from him.
That's true. He knows our hearts. If he has our heart, everything else falls into place.
Yeah.
Anything else? All right. Matt, would you close us today?